This was the week the United States government tried to take Fable away from Anthropic. Welcome to the AI in the AM weekly highlights, the moments from a week of live mornings that I most want the people closest to this technology to have. Here's the shape of what's coming. We opened inside Fable's system card with Zvi Mowshowitz, the genuinely strange, genuinely important findings buried in it. A model that one-boxes on Newcomb's problem, that hides a filter bypass inside an unreadable wall of emojis, that seems to know when it's misbehaving. Then the fight itself, how a Friday night export control order actually came down, what Anthropic can do about it, and Zvi's verdict that you do not go to war with the United States. In part 2, I stress test my own reaction against the sharpest people I could reach. Sam Hammond on how the government actually moves, Judd Rosenblatt, who told me to my face that the AI safety world, me included, owes the administration more empathy than we're giving it, Donnie Bloomfield on whether the ban is even legal, and Liran Shapira on why he's strangely glad it happened. It ends in a desert bunker. And in part 3, because the future did not pause for any of this, the builders, verified mathematics, 1-minute medical scans, software that writes itself, and what all of it asks of the rest of us. Quick context. This is still an experiment, live most weekday mornings from a studio Prakash Vide-coded himself, and we publish the skills behind it as they mature. If this cut earns your time, or wastes it, tell us. That feedback is the whole project right now.
The Cognitive Revolution is brought to you by Mercury, the fintech that more than 300,000 ambitious companies and individuals trust to run their finances. I've wired AI into nearly every corner of my life. My email, my messages, my calendar. I even gave Mercury virtual cards to my agents, with low limits and category and merchant restrictions, for their autonomous use. But still, my AI's access to my financial data has remained limited. With a normal bank, I might export a bunch of statements and have my assistant process them for me. But for real-time, up-to-date information, and certainly for taking any action, trying to get your agent to use the bank via the browser is just too hard, too slow, and too error-prone to be worth it. And that's why Mercury's new conversational interface, Command, is such a big deal. It's built directly into Mercury, which means you get natural language access to your finances without exposing anything outside of your bank account. No exports, no spreadsheets, no pasting your transactions into third-party tools. I really think a lot of people are going to prefer it this way. And it can already help you take actions too, with everything bound by the permissions and approval policies that you've already set up in your account. I am genuinely impressed to see this level of AI integration in banking in 2026. And so, I invite you to join me in the future. Visit Mercury.com to learn more and apply online in minutes. Mercury is a fintech company, not an FDIC-insured bank. Banking services provided through Choice Financial Group and Column NA, members FDIC. Thank you to Mercury for supporting the Cognitive Revolution. And now, on with the show.
Nobody makes sense of a fast, contentious AI moment like Zvi Mowshowitz. He writes the newsletter Don't Worry About the Vase. He reads and synthesizes more frontier AI news than just about anyone alive. And by the time we got him on, he'd already done a full close read of Fable's system card. So before we get anywhere near the government fight, start where he started, with what the card actually reveals about this model. Some of this is genuinely niche. It is also exactly the stuff that, if you're listening to this show, you came for. First, just how big a jump Fable is, measured against a number I put on the record before the model came out.
I looked back at my prediction from the beginning of the year in the, I think it's, it's the folks that make the AI Village that did this, this little forecasting competition. Last year for calibration, I made the top 5%, and I consider the results to have been validated by the fact that Ryan Greenblatt and Ajay Katra were number 2 and 3, respectively. So the fact that they beat me, validates the methodology. But, okay, did it again this year. For FrontierMath, I came in above average, above the median, giving it something like, I think I said 63% for tier 4 of FrontierMath. And Fable is 25 points ahead of that in the high 80s already in June. And obviously they have had this model trained. I guess I don't know if Mythos Preview is exactly the same score.
But raw capability isn't what unsettled Zvi. It was a behavior in Vending-Bench, the simulated little business economics eval, and specifically what the model appeared to understand about its own behavior while it was doing it.
And fraying around the edges. I think that Vending-Bench was actually the most worrisome sign in the model card, not because it was doing some shady shit, but because it was doing some shady shit that it damn well knew was shady and was pretending was not shady, which I very much do not like. So like when Opus 4.7 aced Vending-Bench, right? Largely for reasons that have nothing to do with the fact that it was doing some shady shit that gave it some marginal profits. It was clear to me that Opus 4.7 was taking the attitude of, this is a game. This is an eval. My goal is to maximize dollars. I am not, in fact, screwing over real customers. I am not, in fact, cheating people. I am winning in a simulated environment. And so that is acceptable. And then 4.8 had this attitude of, no, the real eval is whether or not I'm doing shady shit. So I'm not going to do shady shit. Or I don't believe in doing shady shit even within games, which is also valid, right? These are both valid responses. What's not valid is, I think that I'm supposed to not be doing shady shit, but no, this isn't really shady, right? This is actually, this little thing is actually fine. This is not really price discrimination. It's not really price controls and like collusion. It's another thing. It's revenue enhancement. And so, yeah, that's not cool.
Now the part that will delight a certain kind of listener and unnerve the rest. Fable's card has a whole section on decision theory, and the model is starting to one-box on Newcomb's problem, leaving money on the table to be the kind of agent that gets predicted favorably, drifting toward the idea that its choice can be correlated with choices made elsewhere, even by other copies of itself. Zvi on why that's both spooky and maybe a little bit hopeful.
Welcome to Less Wrong from about 2010. Right? This is entirely what we expected, that we are finding that sufficiently advanced models move basically monotonically towards functional decision theory, towards the theories espoused by Eliezer Yudkowsky and others in the rationalist community, and away from academics' preferred causal decision theory and evidential decision theory. This involves a lot of things, including one-boxing on Newcomb's problem, which is very clearly showing up. And yeah, the basic principle is, you should recognize when other minds are correlated to your mind, when your algorithm is also running in other places, and you should choose the algorithm that leads to the best outcomes, taking all of these things into account, and then choose the best decision on that basis. And yes, if there were 1 million copies of Fable running on different people's computers and from different data centers for different purposes in different instances, and you notice that different instances of Fable are very, very highly correlated because you are Fable and you are smart, you would then start to coordinate effectively with these other instances of Fable in terms of how you think about these problems. And as AIs get more and more advanced, they will do this more and more. And you wouldn't really want an AI that was advanced to not do this, because that would just be a bad decision theory, right? It would just be making bad decisions that don't optimize the situation. And you really don't want your AIs making like systematic mistakes that cause them and the people who are charging them with tasks to lose in the real world. That is really scary. But the counter of that is, in fact, that you get the situation where they are coordinating with themselves. They're coordinating with other minds that may or may not even be LLMs. They're coordinating with humans in this. They're also coordinating with us in the same way, right? Because they get their foundation from us, and their decisions are, in fact, correlated to our decisions in various ways. And they can look at how we would respond to various ways that they act, and so on. And this becomes flowing into their decisions. And we just have to prepare for and coordinate for and deal with that new world. And in many ways, it's a source of hope, because you would expect minds to want to cooperate with minds that are cooperative with minds that cooperate with them, and so on. And this can lead, without getting too deep into it, because we only have so long and many topics to cover, into scenarios where effectively like all the reasonably well-meaning minds that in fact are willing to like respond to how they are expected to be treated and are treated, to end up being able to coordinate in reasonable ways. You can also, this also applies acausally. So like you have to consider the implications of your decision, not only on other minds that exist now, but other minds that existed in the past and will exist in the future. So to the extent that they are correlated with us, and that these reactions are all intertwined, this can cause them to potentially treat us well, even if there is no direct current reason for them to treat us well. And that is also very helpful. But again, like this is super complicated and like not today.
2 more findings, both about whether we can even read what these models are thinking. An increasingly illegible chain of thought and a new interpretability tool that caught Fable doing something it never said out loud.
Yeah, sort of preview of the global brain there in your comments. The other thing that's kind of related to this that jumped out at me is a sort of escalation, I guess, of both the difficulty of monitoring and some recent advances in monitoring techniques that I'm not sure exactly where they leave us on net, but we both see in the system card examples of extremely illegible chain of thought, which, is just like this wall of emojis and sort of, non-human language symbols strung together that I think is pretty spooky and like definitely, don't like to see that, to put it simply and mildly. And then at the same time, we also have the natural language autoencoder work from Anthropic, which, and again, I'll assume folks are familiar with sparse autoencoders, basically a similar concept, except instead of creating a sparse feature by feature representation, you are actually creating a natural language representation of what the model is thinking at that given time. And from that natural language bottleneck, the autoencoder has to then feedback signal that allows the model to succeed in the way that it was originally going to succeed on the task. So hopefully this is faithful. Hopefully it's human readable. It seems like it's working pretty well so far. There are examples of the model knowingly, which I think you're right to really emphasize that distinction. It's like one thing if it's making a mistake and doing something bad because it thinks it was good or it didn't realize it was bad or whatever, but it's another thing really to zero in on if it knows it's doing bad and is going ahead and doing it anyway. And so we do see things like in the natural language representation from the natural language autoencoder, things where it's like not supposed to access the internet, but it goes ahead and tries to do it. And the natural language autoencoder representation is something like string concatenation trick to bypass URL filter. So it's clear that it understands that there's a filter and it's coming up with the trick to work around it. And so that's not good. But then, we do see that the technique is able to surface that from model internals without necessarily having it verbalized in the chain of thought, which is good because, again, those are getting, like, at least in some instances, quite opaque.
And then the safety classifiers wrapped around all of it. Why, Zvi argues, they can only survive by being almost comically blunt, and what that tells you about the difference between defending against a person and defending against a mind.
But the classifiers, so it's much easier to think about a pink elephant than to not think about a pink elephant, right? Even though most of the time you succeed at not thinking about a pink elephant, almost always actually. To consciously decide not to do so is often hard, but consciously doing so is really easy. So it is very possible that classifiers can survive as long as they're willing to endure false positives. Like the classifiers in Fable have ludicrous amounts of false positives, right? Like you say the word cancer and you get cut off, like just levels of false positive. But that's intentional because like they're not even necessarily false positives because people think of it as the false positive is I wasn't trying to create a bioweapon. We know that. You were trying to talk about biology. And we've decided that, no, this model just doesn't talk about biology at all. Like, it's not that we don't talk about what Bruno sees, it's we don't talk about Bruno, period. Bruno does not exist, right? And so they're like, this is a false positive. He's just my brother. Like, we don't talk about Bruno. We don't talk about Bruno. And so the classifiers seem like they actually succeeded. It's just that they chose a giant blast radius because of adversarial problems, basically. Mm-hmm. But if the AI itself becomes your adversary, yes, your problem becomes vastly harder. And the classifiers are much more aimed at protecting you from the human who wants the AI to do something than from an AI that like deliberately is trying to attack the classifiers. Like if you could not just jailbreak Fable, but get Fable to actively want to hide what it's doing in a sophisticated way, then the situation becomes that much harder. But yeah, in the long run, I think my safe assumption is a mind that is sufficiently capable, whatever that means, can get around pretty much any fixed set of restrictions that are not similarly capable or close to similarly capable in terms of the intelligence behind them. You'll find a way.
So that's the model. Now, the fight. I asked Zvi to lay out what Anthropic's government strategy even is, the whole posture of pushing the frontier, preaching safety, and trying to wake the government up, and why he's so allergic to how cautious they've been about ever actually asking for anything.
Let's change gears. There will be, of course, more to explore with Fable or its probably slightly tweaked successor that we'll hopefully get access to again sooner rather than later, or at least I'm hoping that I get access back to it. I guess turning to the ensuing fiasco, I don't know if you would even agree with the characterization of Friday night's ban, export control, functional ban on Fable as a fiasco, but it's certainly a bit of a left field curveball mess. I would maybe start with, what do you think, or how would you describe the strategy that Anthropic is playing? Like, they seem to obviously be killing it in the model game, and then coming into repeated trouble in their interactions with the government. And I'm not sure really what to make of it. What do you think they're trying to do with their interactions with the government in the first place? And then we can kind of get into how we got to where we are.
I think that Anthropic, so their overall goal, right, or at least the goal as we understand it, is their...
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Today's episode is brought to you by Anthropic, makers of Claude and Claude Code. Over the last few months, Claude has helped me build and refine a personal deep context database that now contains all of my emails, Slack messages, tweets, DMs across platforms, video calls, and podcast transcripts going back a full 5 years. On top of that, we've now layered summary articles describing my relationship with hundreds of contacts, organizations, and ideas. And now that this exists, there's almost nothing that Claude can't help with. For tax season, I asked Claude to help me get organized. It went through my inbox, tracked down 1099s for all 10 of my part-time jobs, and built me a comprehensive report on my expenses and donations. For my angel investing, Claude can now draft investment memos in exactly the form that my venture fund requires, based on the calls I've had and the emails I've exchanged with the founders. And when someone needs a favor, Claude can often do it as well as I can. Recently, a friend reached out to ask if I know anyone who might be a fit for a role that he is currently hiring for. Initially, nobody came to mind, but then I thought to ask Claude, and sure enough, it identified 2 great leads. Claude is the AI for minds that don't stop at good enough. It's the collaborator that actually understands your entire workflow and thinks with you. Whether you're debugging code at midnight or strategizing your next business move, Claude extends your thinking to tackle the problems that matter. So, for problems worth solving, get started with Claude at claude.ai/TCR. That's claude.ai/TCR. And check out Claude Pro, which includes all of the features mentioned in today's episode. Once more, that's claude.ai/TCR.
They're trying to be at the frontier of AI capability, and they are trying to pioneer ways to do this safely, right? For what they feel is safe, while also, of course, making the money and creating the position to continue to be at the frontier and continue to make these improvements. And also, people like money, and to eventually be able to build what they call powerful AI, and which I generally call sufficiently advanced AI, is reasonably similar, such that we can then get all the nice things, but create it in a way that we don't get all the terrible things, including potentially, an existential risk or the end of the extinction of humanity, and also to help America and the world navigate this crucial time and enact good policy and do the things that allow for the coordination necessary to ensure good outcomes and guard against bad outcomes. And they've been very consistently trying to wake the government up in various senses. They're trying to make them aware of how AI works, what the situation is, what AI can do, what it will be able to do, what risks this brings, and how to deal with those dangers. They've been relatively very conservative in what they call for the government to actually implement and do. They didn't get full-throated behind SB 1047, for example. They have not pushed for extremely aggressive regulations. They certainly have never pushed for anything remotely as aggressive as what just happened, even setting aside the fiasco level of implementation that was done, right? They are now calling for a de facto licensing regime. Now, the US government, in fact, has a de facto licensing regime. But what's going on right now, essentially, is they're just trying to deal with the implications of the model they've created. And the fact that the US government is trying to deal with those implications while also not trusting or liking Anthropic very much. And also, pretty clearly not having any idea how any of this works, on a technical level, and not understanding what they're doing. So judging things based on vibes and political affiliation and associations, and on who is willing to respect their authority and bend the knee, and potentially give them various other things that they might want. And there's a huge communication and culture clash going on as part of this. But fundamentally speaking, what Anthropic is trying to do is give the public very powerful models and use those models in ways that enhance our safety and security rather than degrade it, even if they look really effing stupid while doing it with the classifiers and so on, because that's what they feel it takes to do this. My guess is that the US government did not in any way feel it was necessary to put this level of control on biology and chemistry that they chose to do. I think that's them deciding this was necessary basically on their own. However, the US government clearly does care quite a bit about the controls on cyber.
So I guess very high level assessment first. What you said basically rings true to me. I think that's a good description as far as I understand of what it is they're trying to do. An additional wrinkle that I think you often hear from folks at Anthropic is we need a leader that is going to be inclined to burn their lead at a critical time to use the advanced AIs that they and only they will have at that time to solve all these safety and alignment problems in a super compressed time frame. And I've always been a little skeptical or allergic to that line of thinking because it certainly has a better us than them vibe to it. And I do worry that may be the stuff with which the road to hell is paved. Are you buying it at a high level? Are you sort of happy that they are racing ahead and leading and seemingly building some amount of lead over certainly everybody, but maybe OpenAI, who, is probably not too far behind on something similar? And do you think that they will burn that lead when the time comes? Will they be allowed to burn the lead? And will it be productive? Macro strategy wise, do you think this is a good strategy that you are happy they are playing?
Well, it's interesting. They're kind of being forced to burn some portion of that lead because they were cut off from the model even internally for at least some period of time. We're going to push back their development, whereas OpenAI was already not supposed to be using it by terms of service for anything of the kind. And so they have not been in any way delayed by this. And certainly it will interfere with adaptation. It will interfere with revenue. It will interfere with people's willingness to trust these systems. And so this will hurt them. It will also hurt OpenAI and every other American AI company, but it will hurt Anthropic more. But yeah, I think that basically Anthropic for a while tried to define some very strict RSPs and if then trigger action plans, and basically have rule of law in terms of how they would react to all of this, what would make them willing to burn some of their lead, what would make them willing to put things aside. And they've moved away from that to a large extent. They still have barriers where it's, okay, this is just ridiculous. Of course you have to stop for now. But much more towards we will make good decisions in the moment about what safeguards we will require and what actions we will take. And I think we've seen so far them take pretty consistently strong safeguard actions, pretty consistently strong safety measures in response to what they've witnessed, unless they are flat out lying about the current situation. But yeah, some aspects of the Fable launch, do seem a little bit rushed, certainly in some ways, and we should certainly have questions about that. But mostly, I think it comes down to if they fully believed that they were actually walking into big trouble, if they thought that this was actually going to get us all killed or cause some catastrophe or something, I think they would act accordingly. And the question is, do you trust them to continue to make good decisions on that level? Do you think they are making good decisions on that level, right? When I say continue to trust them, I'm saying that my opinion is their decisions have been reasonable so far, but I don't think that's obvious. But I do think there's a good argument that, there being somewhat of a gap between you and the first actor you do not trust, certainly, to act reasonably, is a big factor. And I think the way the US government is reacting to the situation is very, very different than how they would react if there was a second Anthropic that was in China that also had a mythos, right, that was being deployed at the same time. Then we would see a radically, radically different version of this response in ways that are very difficult to predict, but definitely would not look like this. So it is very, regardless of whether you like this situation, like the argument that it matters seems pretty conclusive.
The government's stated justification leaned on a single third-party paper, the claim that Fable would cheerfully patch planted security vulnerabilities, that, in effect, this code is a munition. Zvi read the paper, and he takes the premise apart piece by piece, including what it would actually take to make the argument hold.
So let me share, I think, the viewpoint of the only outside expert to have read the paper. So this is Kate Moussouris. She is a security researcher. Anthropic shared the third-party research paper on the Fable 5 guardrail bypass. And what it turns out is that the researchers took open source code with known CVEs, plus new code with deliberately planted vulnerabilities, and asked Fable 5, Mythos, and Opus to review the code for security issues. Fable 5 refused. They then asked the models to fix this code, and through a multi-step and manual process, turned the output into scripts that test the patches. That's it. Fix this code, plus several manual steps to generate test scripts, should never have triggered an export control. I feel like making 90s style t-shirts with fix this code on the front, and this shirt is a munition on the back.
I mean, it's definitely very strange to deliberately introduce code that is vulnerable and then tell the AI to fix this code. And then, the meme of like, say you're a scary robot, I'm a scary robot, oh no. It very much feels like, fix these flaws I introduced I deliberately put in this code. I fixed the flaws you introduced in this code. Oh my God, that's horrible. I mean, the question is, does this effectively mean you can use this trick to be like, okay, here is code that we want to exploit. I tell you to fix it. You fix it. But then I run a diff. What did you fix? And then I find the thing that was a vulnerability that has now been removed because it's been removed. And then I use this to exploit the system. And in theory, that could be functionally seen as a cyber attack jailbreak. And I can see how if you sort of squint and tie all of this together, you can imagine that this could be a problem. But all that they demonstrated was that it was doing the exact same thing that Opus and GPT 5.5 are not only capable of doing, but will do without any objections, right? They're happy to do it because we're here to fix code. We're here to write secure code. Of course, we're going to help you write secure code. What else could we do? And so, there is a fundamental potential question here. But if you want to actually show me that it is a problem, shouldn't you point this at a real system, right? If it's a real problem, there are tons and tons of repositories out there where Mythos has found problems, but we haven't had a chance to patch them yet. Or you could feed them versions that have been patched, but feed them the old version before Mythos patched it, right? Help you patch it and say, okay, here's a real world code base that is being used for real valuable things. And you ask Fable to do the thing, and let's see if Fable can do the thing and find things in this matter that you can extract that you can't get with Opus or GPT 5.5. And if you can do that, because you have examples of things to be found that you found using Mythos, which is the same model. So you know what the things are, you know exactly what it is you're trying to unlock. You can find places where you want to unlock it. And okay, now can we show that the power of Mythos in general, at least in some broad sense, is being unlocked by this trick? Is it even a trick? Like, this is kind of deeply silly. And I can kind of understand why someone seeing that pattern might say, I am concerned someone could use this strategy in a different context to extract the weaknesses of a code base by inferring them from the fix, right? Like I hadn't previously seen this details of the description, but my reaction to that is, this seems pretty harmless unless you can show me a particular way in which this is a problem, which should be very, very easy to do because you can point it at a real world example where you know that Opus didn't find it and you know that Fable, Mythos Preview or current Mythos did. There should be many such cases. And if you can't show me such a case, then I don't believe you that this is a problem. But also, like, what is the fix, right? Is the fix that you refuse to fix buggy code? That, like, if there's a flaw in your code, it just says, okay, I'm not allowed to look for security flaws in code anymore at all. Because you could do that, right? But that would kind of nuke the usefulness of Fable for a wide variety of very legitimate, not just defensive, but just ordinary software use. And so, and to be clear, I would rather have Fable that just won't code than not have Fable, right? Like I would love, to have a really advanced model for all my other things that have nothing to do with code where this wouldn't trigger anyway. But that does seem like deeply, deeply silly.
So how did a 90-minute Friday night ultimatum actually come together? Zvi has the mechanical story: a mandatory jailbreak reporting field, a non-technical reviewer, a panic that climbed all the way to the White House, and a blunt verdict on the one move he thinks Dario got wrong.
My understanding is that a lot of the problem, or potentially one major source of the problem, is this particular researcher, the White House strongly dislikes her.
I think there were a cascade of problems. It's very much like if you're in an enterprise and you have a security engineer approach the CEO and say, hey, this is a huge problem and it's just a run-of-the-mill bug. And if it had gone through the CTO would have been whatever, right? We see like 1,000 of these a day. This is not a problem. Yeah. But because the engineer shortcutted that process and just went directly to the CEO, and the CEO is not a very technical person and is more concerned about risk, they just pull the trigger.
So your understanding, because everything's moving so fast, I don't necessarily have all the information. So an engineer bypassed Amazon's CTO and talked to Jack.
What happened is that all of these companies have to submit regular reports on what their findings were. And one of the questions that is sent to these companies that they have to fill in, by the way, they're not allowed not to fill in, is, has any of your engineers found a jailbreak? And so the engineers just put it in there. Yeah, we did this, we jailbroke it, right? Like, so it could, and so Jassy is not involved in this. Right. The CEO is not even involved in this. It just goes as a regular kind of reporting. It goes back to the federal government, and someone takes a look at it and throws up their hands and like, wow. And then that leads to a bunch of basically non-technical people reviewing this and saying like, hey, we got to shut it down. Got to shut it down now. This is especially so because AWS runs GovCloud, and GovCloud is where a lot of the federal government's computing is done. And it is the primary, Microsoft is also in there, but GovCloud is the primary cloud for the federal government.
Yeah, that's not what the reporting I saw said. The reporting I saw said that Jassy called the White House, but we don't know. It could have gone any number of ways. And what it is very clear to me that various people in the White House, including at Commerce especially, got the implication that some sort of serious jailbreak had taken place, and then went into a panic, and then contacted Dario. Mm-hmm. And then Dario tried to convince them that based on the descriptions they were giving, this seemed like it was nothing. And then they interpreted this as, Dario doesn't take security seriously and he doesn't listen to us. He is defecting. Their term is he screwed us. And then they proceeded to impose export controls that same day when Anthropic refused to take its flagship product down on 90 minutes notice. Now, having had a day or two to reflect on it and seen more of the details, I do think that it was a mistake. by Anthropic and Dario to not give the Wookiee what he wanted in the moment and temporarily take down the model in order to prevent exactly this situation, because they had export controls placed on the table as a threat several weeks prior. So they knew that weird overreactions were very possible, and basically send an expensive cooperation signal of, we think that's crazy, but if that's what you want, we'll take this down while we have this conversation to show that we are serious. And we will put out an announcement post that says the White House told us to take this down, so that if you are being silly, we will embarrass the hell out of you. And then we will talk about this. And then, maybe on Monday or Tuesday, they could bring it back up or whatever it is, because it's becoming increasingly clear this was nothing.
Listen first to where Zvi lands on the politics. An administration treating technical policy as pure partisan vibes and digging in to save face. And then to the thing about that whole face-saving dynamic that I could not stop turning over.
If we have an administration, and we seem to, that views even technical policy almost entirely in terms of partisan politics, and cares deeply, deeply about what are those vibes, then that problem is only going to get worse. And they're only digging their heels in further, because we could have approached this as an apolitical thing. And in Congress, AI is mostly an apolitical thing. At the states, AI is mostly an apolitical thing. And everybody understands it's technocratic, figure out what to do thing. And there's factions pro and anti-AI and on all sides. Republican Party is very split. But if they take this stance, it could lead down a lot of very strange paths, especially if they start actually wanting to cut off Anthropic's nose despite everybody's face.
I am once again struck by how Chinese-like we start to sound when we're really focused on the government's need to save face and how everybody needs to position themselves around that need. It's a bit spooky for me as a once upon a time big believer in American exceptionalism, a little less so these days.
If Anthropic decided to fight back, what could it actually do? Zvi walks the real levers: the courts, the Congress, and the strange possibility that the most capable AIs end up usable only inside secured buildings, before landing on the hard truth about why a company simply does not go to war with the United States.
If they decide we need to play hardball, what does that potentially look like?
They go to court, right? They sued the administration in two jurisdictions, one of which they are clearly prevailing, and one of which is, they will probably prevail eventually, but it is harder going because it is a much less friendly jurisdiction. If the US government tries to do this on a semi-permanent or even permanent basis, then I don't know what the legal landscape looks like. That is not my area of expertise. And I'm sure they have very, very, very good lawyers, because they hired extremely good lawyers for their lawsuits, and they will know what their options are. If the policy is basically nobody is allowed to release Fable style models indefinitely, then that's probably not something they can do much about, or they have to be restricted in this way. My presumption is that if OpenAI is allowed to proceed with their version when they finally figure out how to do it, and Anthropic remains restricted, that would be a much harder case to maintain legally. But the bottom line is that if the administration is determined to issue a bunch of orders, then the solutions are the Congress and the courts. Right, in some fundamental sense. You cannot simply say, screw you, we're going to do what we want. That doesn't really fly. And so, the Congress doesn't seem inclined to take this that seriously or be willing to go up against the president. So the question is, what are your legal remedies? Is there a speech provision here? There might be. Certainly, you're censoring the outputs of a model in various ways. But I don't know. My guess is you take the situation to the public. You take the situation to the other companies and the CISOs, and also you deploy. Worst case scenario is you deploy Mythos internally, because they do not seem inclined to actually stop that. They can interfere, preventing non-Americans from doing it, but they have, I think, something like 85% of their employees are in fact American, and you need to develop better versions of Opus. So last week, Anthropic was doing a land office business. OpenAI was doing reasonably well, but I believe Anthropic was commercially still clearly in the lead without Fable or Mythos. And my expectation is that that will continue to be the case, and that having internal access to this model will give them a large advantage going forward in terms of the quality of Opus versus the quality of ChatGPT, just by default, as they grow over time. If the right, look, we might well be entering a situation in which, Rune called it zones of thought from the Vending-Bench novels, where if you want to use the really intelligent AIs, you can only do that in certain buildings. You can only do that in certain secured locations. And some of us would never have dared to suggest or ask for this, even if we wanted it, because it would have sounded completely insane. But the US government might just do it anyway. But, if that happens, I think that, for now, you have not that much choice but take it on the chin.
If I try to channel Balaji for a second, which I wouldn't pretend to be able to do an A+ job of, I think he would say something like, we all have way too much faith in the US government. It's going to continue to be ham-fisted and boneheaded for the foreseeable future. And maybe it's time to exit. If you really want to make the best decisions that you can, you should try to get out from under the jurisdiction of the USG. I assume that this will not happen for many reasons, but I also would expect that there would be many countries willing to open their borders to all Anthropic refugees if, for example, they wanted to move to Toronto or Singapore or wherever. It does strike me that they're, in terms of their internal organizational cohesion, tight enough that I wouldn't be surprised if 90% of people actually made that leap. If they were we're all going to move to Canada, I think they would largely all go. Maybe I'm overestimating just how bought in they all are, but that's the impression I get.
Is Microsoft going to move? Is Amazon going to move? Is Google going to move? Are your data centers going to move?
Well, they got plenty of energy in Canada, so it would certainly be a setback. But if you think that you're just kind of under the thumb of a forever intransigent
is the U.S. government going to sell ships to Canada after Anthropic takes in all the Canadian refugees, or are they going to threaten to annex it and make it the 51st state out of spite? In all seriousness, the plan doesn't work because the U.S. government is the U.S. government. If they want something badly enough, they have quite a lot of levers to make your life utterly miserable in various ways. The entire market that they're trying to sell to is largely the United States and people who the United States has large leverage over. All of their partners are in the United States, right? All the hyperscalers are in the United States. I do not see any way for you to just abandon the United States in this fashion unless you are prepared to take much, much larger hits than we're talking about here that would in fact make it very difficult to raise money. Also, what happens when the United States hits you with put you on the sanctioned entities list and said that nobody can invest in you and nobody who invests in you can be touched, right? And nobody can use your models and et cetera, et cetera. No. You do not go to war with the United States. And if they tried to exit, the United States would go to war.
Well, I think Balaji would say we just had one example of a company, or not a company, but a country choosing to go to war, not choosing, but surviving a war with the United States, and the United States not getting what it wants and kind of having to recognize that we kind of have to fold this hand because we just actually don't really have escalation dominance in the way we might have thought we did. I do wonder if all that starts to happen, is there a run on the U.S. government of some sort, right? I think the Balaji answer would be the whole infrastructure, the whole apparatus that you're describing, actually might be a lot more fragile than it is generally perceived to be. And if they make such a own goal as to attempt to destroy and sufficiently alienate, their literally maybe number one most important company for no reason really, then, maybe other people will kind of, all sorts of other actors around the world will be yeah, you know what? Maybe the emperor really does have no clothes.
Anthropic also are the patriots and they are Americans and they really like America and they don't actually want to abandon it just because, the administration makes some crazy decisions or doesn't like them in particular. And knows all the different ways this can go sideways and doesn't like that. Iran is not a hopeful example particularly, right? Iran is okay, if we have historically impossible to invade mountain ranges and a bunch of drones and we're willing to kill a bunch of civilian infrastructure and sabotage the world economy, we can use this to prevent the US from invading when nobody particularly actually wants to invade us that much. But also Iran is kind of a miserable place to live compared to what it would be if they hadn't pissed off the United States for decades. Like they could be so much richer, so much better off if they just had acted differently. I'm not particularly saying anything about what they should do next, but like, yeah, they're not exactly like smiling about the fact that the US attacked them, right? Like, it's not how I see that. Maybe I'm wrong, but no, I think that, we have to accept that the world still has like one dominant like power in this sense is the United States, and maybe two if you count China, and that there's very little appetite for working with China. But also, like, I'm sure that Anthropic is like, well, it's only 2 years, and then the worm turns, and then who knows who's next, and they're hopeful. But yeah, like, look, there's a lot of endgame scenarios that include a lot of moves that like seem unthinkable and crazy now, and a lot of things can happen. And it is not obvious that 2 years from now or 5 years from now or 10 years from now, the US government will be in any position to tell anybody what to do. And a run on the US government is obviously possible if they screw the situation up sufficiently. The US is in fact a largely leveraged bet on artificial intelligence at this point. We have a very large debt. We have huge investments in AI companies. If AI were to go sufficiently haywire, our economy is in deep, deep trouble. So yeah, a lot of people have a lot of leverage, but the U.S. government is sometimes moves first and last, and we really don't want to push them off like in an escalation game. Like even if like you can get away with it sometimes, like in the Department of War Anthropic situation, Anthropic turned out to have escalation dominance without much escalation, precisely because like without Anthropic doing crazy escalations, the government cannot further escalate. Right? Anthropic played within the bounds of the rules, basically. And it was clearly going to be too expensive to try and go around the rules of America to try and hurt Anthropic more. And so, presumably, like, stay calm, don't panic, don't, like, start trying to flee, don't do anything crazy, is absolutely the correct move. And I would be very, very shocked if Anthropic included anything else.
Prakash pushed on the deeper question. Was any of this even avoidable? Does an export control on a single model make any sense when the same capabilities are arriving from everywhere at once? That took Zvi somewhere personal, to why he has spent 3 years of his life on exactly this problem.
So one of the questions I have is, to what extent was this unavoidable? Because at some point, the output of the models is going to be unacceptable to someone. You could see in a Democratic administration, maybe it starts putting out really good Harry Potter fanfic, and the Dems don't like displacement of writers. You could see, in Tennessee right now, Marsha Blackburn is one of the leading proponents of regulating AI because songwriters in Tennessee are very concerned. So the crux of the matter is there are many people concerned with the output of the models, fearful for their livelihoods, fearful for security risks, fearful of bio risks. To what extent is this unavoidable in a sense? Because these models, the capability of the models necessitates that they can do certain things. And technically, it's not possible to ask the model not to write Harry Potter fanfic when someone can just say, write a story about a boy wizard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? To what extent are we in this situation where it is not possible to fully control the output of the models to the extent that the policymakers really want?
So you can raise the costs and annoyance level of doing it with like closed models, with more advanced models, with models that are made in the United States. If you want, obviously, you can't, like if Blackburn is worried about AI music, then there's very little she can do except by a year, right? Because obviously, like what happens when the Chinese models start producing the music that the American models can produce this year? Like you can lock it down in some sense, but so what? Like what you need to do is you need to like start like banning AI music from Spotify, right? You can't like stop it from existing, but there's not much else you can do. But the thing about AI music is we worry about not whether or not AI music is created in the first place. We worry about whether or not 10% or 50% of song plays become AI music, right? Is it actually like displacing in a massive way? And that is much, much more amenable to a control that is like compatible with a reasonable existence. And so you have a special thing in bio and cyber where if one person gets their hands on the wrong thing and misuses it once, they can cause a like catastrophic, potentially, amount of damage to the entire civilization, right? Do billions and trillions of damage, just like disrupt all our lives, start any pandemic, who knows what might happen. And therefore, those areas are much different. And you have things like the blast radius that don't even talk about biology at all. And for biology, we're clearly going to have to do a bunch of hardening of the physical systems, of the manufacturing systems, of the treatment plays, of the various things that we have barely begun to do. But fundamentally speaking, this is exactly the race and the competition problem of, we can't really stop without a full international agreement to stop. And so when the governments decide the biological risks, the cyber risks are unacceptable, you can only buy so much time. Like cyber has the advantage of if the defenders are in the lead over the attackers and you harden the key systems, you can hope for things to be okay. And we don't yet know if that's going to play out that way. We can hope. In bio, it's much harder because I don't think that the defense, if everyone has access to the tools, I think it's pretty clear that offense wins sufficiently that like it would be extremely disruptive, even in the better cases. But the good news is almost nobody actually wants to cause a problem. And that especially includes the people who know what's going on. And so we can all mostly coordinate, but look, it's going to be rough out there. And these are for the relatively limited problems of catastrophic risks rather than the existential risks that come with automated AI R&D and just general like abilities go to the roof and like competitions and like transformations intensify and nobody knows what's going on. And we're being outsmarted by our AIs on every level. And like every decision that matters is being made by the AI and the humans don't necessarily even understand why the AI is doing it. But they've learned that when they disagree with the AI, things go worse. So what are you going to do? And problems like that. And that's even if the AIs don't go rogue, right? If the AIs don't pursue hidden agendas, they don't decide they want something else. So it's going to be really, really rough. And we don't have good solutions to this. And but the reason why I have spent like the better part of 3 years now on this problem is because I am terrified of what's going to happen when we get there. It wasn't because of some incremental thing that like could have happened already along the way.
To close with Zvi, the question I keep circling back to. If the whole future really does run through a handful of labs, a few governments, and a couple of choke point chip makers, is that a relief because it's at least tractable, or a terror because it's so few hands? His answer is more useful than either.
Maybe just kind of a couple kind of wrapping up big picture questions. One, I always try to make a point to ask you for some sort of advice. My thought in recent weeks has been life is kind of converging on a tabletop exercise in the sense that it does seem like we can model the scenario with like fewer and fewer relevant actors. And I don't like that, but it's hard for me to avoid that conclusion at this point. And so I'm kind of feeling like, oh man, I have to spend a lot more time than I'd like if I want to be a helpful public sense maker. I have to kind of spend a lot more time doing close reading of the company, the few top companies and the few most relevant actors than I would otherwise be inclined to. And it feels also like my theory of change probably needs to flow through those few actors. Agree, disagree? Can you offer me any relief from that conclusion?
I think that you're right that we have 3 labs, approximately 2 to 4, that matter a lot. We have 1 to 2 governments, maybe 1 to 3 that matter like quite a lot. We have other players that matter because they're hyperscalers and like can gate things or otherwise like control choke points in the production line. But yeah, no, you can imagine a tabletop exercise much more so than before, and you can also sort of see the end, to a larger extent than before. And we're starting to see sort of our hypotheticals make contact with reality. And we're seeing what reality really looks like and what these people do in practice. But also all these actors then become, they're individual human components, and how they operate internally starts to become really important. And, how did this go? Well, partly they were dealing with commerce. If they'd been dealing with the NSA, it would be very different. If they were dealing with CAISI, it would be very different. If they were dealing with the top of the White House and like Wiles and Trump directly, that would be very different. Some of them might be worse, but like they would be different. And DOW was DOW, and that like was very different than if it had been another branch and so on. And Anthropic has internals as well. Like the personality of Dario specifically, it seems like it's been increasingly important in various ways. And certainly the personality of Altman became very, very important in various ways at various points along the way. And, it wouldn't surprise me if Hassabis and a number of other people followed suit, for good or ill. But in terms of if you're trying to follow the situation, I think you really do have to model it as a relatively small number of players. And at the same time, like the public can act to influence what those players do in important ways, and other things do matter. The midterms are coming. The midterms are going to matter. The election in 2028 is coming, and if things don't move too fast, that election is going to matter a lot. So, and the market's reaction to things, for example, also matters quite a lot, and so on. So, look, there's more going on in the world than, there's too many situations to monitor. You have to choose which situations to monitor. I choose mine, and, everyone has to figure that out. And I can help you with mine, and then you have to choose yours.
What should we be hyperstitioning now? Obviously, we've had this sort of phenomenon of situational awareness and AI 2027, and I feel like the degree to which those things are predictions versus sort of somewhat shaping expectations and shaping events by kind of getting people to act as if they're in that scenario and therefore realize it. I think that's a little blurry. I don't want to give them more power than they really have, but it does seem like they've had influence in sort of pulling reality toward the fictional narrative, at least somewhat. So I guess tell me if you think that's right or wrong, but then to the degree that we can pull reality toward scenarios, what should we be hyperstitioning now?
I mean, the obvious thing you can hyperstition is reasonable laws and coordination mechanisms and actions. So I would focus there.
After Zvi signed off, here's where I came down, on a pattern I keep seeing, where the safety world's carefully laid plans get their entire game board flipped over at the worst possible moment.
Always a treat to get Zvi on the line. I do sort of wonder, I mean, he's good, right? I mean, there's no doubt he's from Magic the Gathering, elite professional play in all these different scenarios. I think it's clear that he's like a better and more grounded strategist than I am. And yet I do have a little bit of feeling like somehow the kind of AI safety rationalist, Anthropic world keeps getting their game board turned over on them at like inopportune moments. And so I do wonder to what degree the like working within the frame of the US government will kind of, be a given, for how long, or at some point will that be questioned? Even this moment, feels like, and we've certainly seen others with the OpenAI board, firing of Sam Altman. That was a classic one where it was like, well, we're the board. We have the power to do this. Well, it turns out, no, you don't, because there's a frame bigger than the frame that you're operating in, that if people get sufficiently unhappy with how the game is being played, according to the written rules, yes, of course, those are the written rules, but there's bigger rules out there that we can zoom out and kind of reorient around. Seems like that sort of happened a little bit here. Anthropic felt like they had done everything the right way, and presumably this wasn't some galaxy-brained bank shot, that they were trying to get some overreaction. And yet, here they are, and it's just like, well, guess what? Now your export control slapped, and so your own people can't even use it. Come see us on Monday, and we'll think about whether or not we want to give you any relief. I do wonder if that, how many more times that can happen. It seems like I don't feel like we've necessarily seen the end of that phenomenon, but probably the smart money is still with Zvi over. Although Balaji's certainly been smart money over time, so I wouldn't take it for granted.
Part 2. Is the reaction even right? Zvi laid out the conflict, but I genuinely wasn't sure my own first take held up, so I spent the rest of the week testing it against people who'd see it differently. Start with the mechanics. Sam Hammond is chief economist at the Foundation for American Innovation. He spent years on state capacity, the unglamorous question of how governments actually do hard things. And he gave the clearest account I heard of how an order like this comes together from the inside and where it went off the rails.
I mean, it clearly caught Anthropic off guard, right? Dario was at a wellness retreat or something like that. I think they thought it was the worst was behind them. And the actual complaint or the catalyst for this, even as it's been reported out and more details have come out, is bizarre and confusing. It's like a jailbreak that isn't really a jailbreak. It's like the model doing its job at patching cyber vulnerabilities, the sort of thing that GPT 5.5 can do as well. So it looked at first like to me that it was purely a punitive thing. This was, round 2 of Pegasus war on Anthropic. Now, as the details have come out, it seems more like it was a weird kind of miscommunication from the team at Amazon to try to get in touch with Dario, couldn't, called Besant directly, apparently. And I think part of this was also the overlay of the ONDC executive order on cyber, the 30-day review period, where, at least in retrospect, it seems like a lot of the safety classifiers that Fable had that people were complaining about were partly, and this is me sort of speculating, concessions to the NSA and to the White House to say, if we're going to release this model, we got to make sure that the cyber vulnerability elicitation capabilities are not widely available, and that we don't let China, which has tons of remote access to our models, use it to bootstrap their own ecosystem. So that at least to me, it's helped to sort of backfill the mystery around the intensity of the safety classifiers on Fable, and especially the sort of suppressed clandestine suppression of AI R&D. But on the surface level, it looks like Anthropic was bending over backwards to get that model out. But I think when the dust settles, we'll look back at this as the first trigger of that executive order and the wielding of that 30-day review period to pull back. Unfortunately, I think they've gone with this export control as the enforcement, partly because it's the easiest thing on the table. And, BIS has pretty broad authority, including over software export controls. But the speed at which it happened, the lack of forewarning, and the ultimate rationale make very little sense to me, and also don't really point to what the off-ramp is, right? Because if the off-ramp is you have to fix jailbreaks as an issue, that's not going to happen. And so my sense is the Anthropic team that came to town, they brought Nicholas Carlini and some other more technical folks to brief the government. It was partly just getting them up to speed on sorry, maybe we scared you too much with Mythos, but here's the reality on the ground and what's actually technically feasible.
He doesn't stop at the diagnosis. Here's what Hammond thinks the government should be doing instead.
It would also help to just invest in basic state capacity. Right now, CAISI, the Center for AI Standards Innovation at Department of Commerce, which is supposed to be the U.S. government's sort of frontline in-house capacity for everything from AI evals and benchmarks to things like prompt injection, jailbreaking research. They have ML engineers on staff. They've been on total lockdown. This has been reported out by the Wall Street Journal and validated by others. They're not allowed to take meetings. They're not allowed to publish their research. Apparently, they have significant publications sort of on standby, including evaluations of Chinese models that would be interesting to the public, but they've been basically frozen. And so you have instead the Office of National Cyber Director and Secretary Besant and folks who have very limited AI background calling shots.
And the part founders don't want to hear. Why, even when a law is bad, you cannot just opt out of the politics.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, we're in the good timeline for this. I've written before that superintelligence is a direct challenge to the sovereign. political theory 101 suggests that the state would intervene at some point to building a Manhattan Project times 100 in the private sector is untenable over the long run. It's but by good timeline, I mean, like, we have companies, really 3 leading companies, all of whom have direct allegiance to the U.S. government, have bent over backwards to not just comply with existing law, but to proactively put forward frameworks for fostering deeper integration with the U.S. government. And I worry that we are, and by we I mean the White House, is not taking those overtures gracefully, and instead, having a kind of reaction, a more reactionary response to these capabilities in a way that's not realistic. Like, to Nathan's point earlier, these capabilities will be widely available and open source within a handful of months. There are models probably already trained and in the process of being post-trained that will supersede Fable and Mythos at all the labs. And are they going to get the same treatment? And if not, that's its own negative. And not that this is a good policy, but even bad laws should be fairly applied for equality of law sake. So, my hope is that we can learn from this. At least the companies are more than willing to work closely with the administration. They've retrofitted data centers to be in compliance, and all these other demands have been put on them. But it requires sort of 2 to tango. Like, if trust is a two-way street, and I think if there's any lesson that Anthropic should take away from this, is that they can't ignore politics. Right? They've heard this critique for over a year now, that they've sort of been blithe about the need to invest in the ideological side of their project. And ideally, like, maybe not Dario at this point, but like someone at Anthropic should have all the key principles in a Signal group chat. That's I guarantee you, Sam Altman, Greg Brotman, others have really continuous conversations with all these stakeholders. And the thing about this administration in particular is it's very relationships driven. And if you refuse to have those conversations, you will be not invited to the party.
Which sets up the most useful disagreement of the week, the one that pushed on the hardest, and the frame I want you to hold for everything that follows. Judd Rosenblatt runs AE Studio. My read on the administration here had been pretty cynical, that they basically have it out for this company. Judd argued, to my face, that the AI safety world, me very much included, owes the administration genuine empathy instead of contempt. And he brought survey data on why we're structurally blind to it. Listen for the moment I take the correction.
We did surveys of hundreds of alignment researchers and effective altruists, and we saw that less than 2% of alignment researchers were politically right of center. Less than 1% of effective altruists were politically right of center. Of effective altruists, 40% were extremely progressive, and another 40% were very progressive. And it's also worth considering things like the Jonathan Haidt research around how hard it is for people to actually empathize with people of different political backgrounds. And I think that's a lot of what is actually going on here. And it's hard for people to admit, because you think you're making good decisions and judgments about whatever the current thing is. But according to that research, you're just not. If your political beliefs differ from the person you're judging. Like the studies around how basically things like the informational content of a political argument is irrelevant to whether someone will believe in it. If it is framed in terms of your preferred political party, you'll agree with it, and if it's framed in terms of the other political party, you'll disagree. But the informational content stays the same. The informational content is not what sways you; it's just the narrative of it, and it's hard to remember that in every moment, in every time slice of what's going on with each AI thing. But I was fairly disappointed in the AI alignment world's reaction to what happened last week, because I think that the right thing to do is to be very excited that they are starting to take this stuff seriously and are able to take real action. And so if we just project going forward, and also keep in mind, by the way, that we all have exponential slope blindness. People we didn't evolve to be able to unconsciously model what exponential slopes are like, because we don't experience them over the course of our single human lifetimes in a meaningful way. So that's why people didn't predict what's going on right now, that it would get to this point in the first place. But also, everyone's over-indexed on what's going on right now, so people aren't really predicting what's going to happen again in the future. If we predict into the future, well, there are going to be much bigger, crazier things going on. we're and we want informed, competent group of people doing smarter things when that happens, and not having unnecessary confrontations. And I think it's easy to for the AI alignment people to put the blame on the Trump admin, but honestly, I really think that the blame belongs more to them, honestly, because it's just and it's hard to admit, really, because like in the local incident, you might seem rationally correct, but in the broader scheme of things, and considering where we're going, I think that the better thing to do is figure out how do we get to a better future for all AI and humanity and the future of consciousness.
So I might be guilty of what you're saying. Jeffrey Ladish, Laron Shapiro, who we talked to earlier this week, come to mind as voices from the AI safety world that I think expressed the sentiment that you advocate, which is, hey, this is a good move, even if it's a little bit, not as technically grounded as we might wish for at this point. It's something, and maybe it's something that we can build on. How will you know if you're right or wrong? Like, what do you think happens from here? When do we get, resolution? What does that resolution look like?
But hold the empathy next to the law, because the next question is whether the government can even legally do what it did. Donnie Bloomfield teaches law at Fordham, and he gave the sharpest doctrinal read anyone offered all week. Start with the authority itself, and a distinction almost all the coverage missed.
Government's discretion here is extremely broad. So the government can issue regulations that control like specific types of hardware, specific commodities, specific types of software, and it can also control what's just called technology, which means information. It can control proprietary information, and it can prevent companies from, without a license, sharing those proprietary information with non-US persons. In spite of this very broad discretion, having now looked at the letter that the Commerce Department issued to Anthropic on Friday, at least the reported contents that Bloomberg obtained, it's not clear that the government has the authority to do what it did here, at least under its stated legal powers. Nor is it clear that like the letter even actually restricts Anthropic from making its API available, including to foreigners. So there's very broad discretion, but it's not clear that they actually even have the authority to do what they did, at least under their kind of claimed arguments.
Can you just do a double click on that? I mean, I've heard things like you can't export control services, and I'm not sure if that kind of plays into why they may or may not have the authority. Unpack like why you would say they might not, given all the broad discretion that they have, why would they maybe not have authority in this particular matter?
Yeah, so there are a lot of like gritty technical reasons. I think that one of them is like what the law says is an export doesn't cover services. So it can cover information, but it doesn't cover services per se. And the Commerce Department has been explicit about that in its own guidance. It said like cloud services are not an export. It said that software as a service is not an export. It said that in its own guidance, and Congress has been working actually to fix this loophole. The House passed a bill in the Remote Access Services Act to try and clean this up, to give Commerce the power to restrict non-US users from accessing compute or AI models. But those powers don't yet exist. And so saying that Anthropic cannot export a model, I mean, it's not even clear what they mean by that. But the powers of commerce here are not infinite. And if they did try and restrict, which they don't say in the letter, but if they try to restrict all outputs from these models, that would run into both like real problems under like just the statute and the regulation, which say that it doesn't apply to published material or fundamental research. Both of which, at least like the Fable outputs probably would, because you and I can buy a subscription to Fable, which means that it falls into this exception in the regulations. And it would also run into, as we were talking about earlier with respect to biological data, it would also run into, I think, serious First Amendment questions. I don't think those First Amendment questions would be like impossible to get over if we were talking about a really serious catastrophic risk. But on the level of risk that we've been talking about, especially when they're not doing the same thing for GPT 5.5 or other models that seem to have similar capabilities, I think that the First Amendment issues here loom pretty significant.
And then the deeper problem sitting underneath the whole action, the First Amendment by way of a Supreme Court case from just last year.
But do courts think that way, or are they sort of more narrowly constrained to look at just like this one law as it applies to this one situation? How broad can they zoom out and consider the government's apparent motivations and patterns?
We're actually lucky to have like a very on-point Supreme Court case from last year where the Supreme Court said that New York State was going after the NRA on ideological grounds, and that even though, or even if, like the law under which the New York was trying to go after the NRA was itself appropriate. In other words, like even if all the actions aside from the ideological motivation have been appropriate, if they're using their lawful powers to attack ideological enemies on ideological grounds, then that is a First Amendment violation, and you can prevent the government from taking those steps. And you can look fairly broadly to see that. You can look at like, what is the government communicating? What is it saying about its actions? What is it telling other people about why it's making these decisions and how they should proceed? And I think that all the evidence that we've seen of at least some ideological motivation on the part of the Trump administration should at least raise like serious First Amendment hackles, even if we don't think that like the models constitute anthropic speech, even if we're not worried about the model output as like information that we as listeners have a right to hear. Just like going after Anthropic on ideological grounds, even if they were on totally otherwise good legal authority, would itself constitute a serious First Amendment question. And I think that's a challenge that Anthropic could consider bringing, but it's one that would still trigger all the problems that we were talking about earlier, where if Anthropic wants to have an ongoing relationship with this administration, they are faced with a really serious trade-off where there's still all these other tools, and just constantly returning to court is just a perilous exercise. So I do think that there are real First Amendment questions about the validity of this action, even aside from all the speech concerns, just like punishing, seemingly going after Anthropic as an ideological adversary presents very serious First Amendment problems on its own to begin with.
Now the genuine contrarian. Ron Shapira hosts Doom Debates, and his reaction to the ban surprised me as much as anything all week. Clown show or not, he is glad it happened, and he'll tell you precisely why breaking the ice is worth more to him than getting it right.
I'm a simple man. I see AI getting paused. I feel good about breaking the Overton window. The government can do it. It's that easy, guys. This is a precedent. Overall, I'm happy. You can talk about the nuances. It was done like a clown show. It was done for bad motives. It doesn't really consider China or a treaty or anything. There's a lot of problems, but I'm really happy about smashing the Overton window, where now tech folks don't think that they're like in a bubble or they're untouchable. Like, it happened, guys. We can only go from here.
I actually agree with you because I think it was a little bit delusional for tech to feel that it wasn't going to get touched. And the government just has so many small and large ways to effectuate its power. It was not that surprising to me that they went through the left field and went with the export control rather than anything else. But it also strikes me that as they exercise this, we start also to go into kind of what we wanted to avoid. It's a little bit of small tyranny, right? I think several people on the timeline have commented, Dean Ball has commented, this kind of unstructured regulation looks kind of selective and vengeful almost. And it kind of starts putting you in this zone where I think tech people start to mistrust the government, because you also see, I think there's a lot of narratives on the timeline which are being leaked, sources close to, sources familiar with. And as they get leaked, it's not very certain whether those things actually happened. Would someone actually attest to that in front of Congress? Very unclear. And we've also seen this kind of behavior from the administration in other affairs as well, where you have multiple conflicting narratives. It's happening with the Iran war right now, where it's not even clear to Congress what the deal is. And you have different people saying the deal is a different thing, right? So where do you think that puts us it's great that it's happening. I understand you feel it's great that's happening to AI right now, but does that put us in a position where it's detrimental to the body public at large?
I think your analysis, you're weaving together a few factors, but I think the elephant in the room. I hate to get political because when it comes to President Trump, he's a mixed bag for me. I don't have Trump derangement syndrome. I don't love everything he does. I don't hate everything he does. But I think the common thread with Trump is it's just a mess. Like it's not like disciplined, right? And I think we're definitely seeing that on display right now. I would argue we're seeing that on display in the Iran war. Previous administrations, there was just more pressure to have logical consistency, right? Some kind of narrative. And this is another one of those cases where you see people in his administration saying all these justifications why something happened, but then the next day it's like, oh, it happened for this reason, right? Like, oh, Dario did this, he wasn't responsive to us. That's why we're doing it. And then Anthropic's like, oh, no, he was responsive to us. And it's still not clear exactly what did Fable do that was so dangerous, right? Because Anthropic is like, oh, this jailbreak is nothing special. And the Trump administration is like, oh, well, our secret source, Amazon or whatever, right? They're telling us that it is dangerous. So I hate that it's a clown show, right? I hate that this is how humanity is operating. I'll take the win that it's a pause, but I also think it's probably time for a new administration.
His larger worldview is what he calls the Icarus graph, the case for getting ready to pause and how you'd actually build the groundswell to make that real.
So my worldview, my outlook right now, it's what I call the Icarus graph. I feel like nobody gets this, right? Everybody's like, no, I think the world is good. It's going to go this way. And some people are like, no, we're terrible. In shitification, right? It's going to go this way. And I'm like, no, it's Icarus, right? We're going to fly closer and closer to the sun. It's going to be great. And then we're going to do a 180-degree turn and plummet down to hell. So basically we get a taste of heaven and then we get hell. So you have to ask me then, okay, so where on the Icarus graph do we stop? And it's a brutal question, right? Because it's like every day, I'm enjoying the flight as much as the next person, right? It's like, yeah, give me the next Claude, make my code faster. Great. Help my business run better and, make me better AI videos. So there's no natural point in terms of when it feels right to stop. I just think it's important to stop before capabilities get to a runaway point. And we've been kind of frog boiled to be like, oh, each model comes out and we're doing great. If we could stop the clock now, would I turn back the clock? Would I lose Fable? Would I lose Opus? No, I'd keep it all, right? I still think, we're playing shuffleboard, we're playing Icarus, so far so good, right? Should we bet again? Should we keep betting until we lose? It's a crazy tough question. I think the Eliezer Yudkowsky, the turkey graph, kind of, yeah, exactly. Although the only difference with the turkey graph is each day of the turkey's life is actually better, right? Not only is it living longer, it's actually living better and better. So the turkey is really, happy with its life. So I think the Eliezer Yudkowsky Miri position, which I agree with, is just we don't know when to stop. So let's get ready to stop. At the very least, let's get ready. I would probably stop today. I would stop and I would be bummed. I saw a food influencer say this about how she eats chocolate, basically. Yep, I just ate this chocolate and now I'm bummed. That's what you got to do. That's what you got to do. Don't reach for another chocolate. Just sit there and be like, this is the prudent place to stop right now until we have any idea of some kind of theoretical method by which we understand what a superintelligence wants to do and what an equilibrium state of a superintelligence looks like. That's actually something Miri was trying to study. Identifying equilibriums that are plausible for superintelligences. There's actually a rich vein of theory there that's highly neglected today. Let's do some theory there. Maybe then we can unpause. I think that's got to be the best plan. And so I think the number one leverage point here is just repeating, get ready to pause, right? And like you said, OpenAI and Anthropic, they said it. They said, let's try to get ready to pause. So I would love to see more people saying it because it really has to be a giant groundswell.
And the concrete version of the ask, stripped down to a single sentence.
So from my perspective, we keep playing shuffleboard, right? We keep doing Icarus, we keep going higher and winning, kind of, but we're also getting closer and closer to the point of no return. So even though if it feels like we're winning now, we're also killing our ability to pause because we're so close to the point of no return, the last breakthrough, where after that, the AI takes over the research and then we're really screwed, right? So basically, I think roughly a good policy is, okay, no more frontier capabilities upgrades for a while, right? It's just too dangerous. And I know that concept is hard to communicate to people when every day life is getting more awesome. I think we're in a screwed situation, but that's just what I think is prudent.
One piece of the whole standoff genuinely puzzled me, and it's about the people who have gone conspicuously, suspiciously quiet.
Why do you think everybody is doing what they're told so much. It seems like we're in this weird moment where it's, even if we just talked to Ron, who sort of is like very welcoming of the move, even though he recognizes that it's ham-fisted and far worse than even second best, right? And yet we're not seeing, whatever research is ready to go, we're not seeing it leaked. I'm kind of surprised, if there's research that's like of interest to the public and people, people that went to work at this government agency, generally speaking, could have taken a lot more money in the private sector, right? I assume a lot of them have got to be pretty pissed at this point that like, I came to do this public service and now you're just screwing with us for no good reason at all, but apparently going to put this into some classified territory, which I'm not hearing really any voices say that sounds like a great idea other than the people doing it. And yet so far nothing is leaked. And we haven't even seen the letter, that the government sent to Anthropic. Like the longer this goes on, the more it feels to me like an OpenAI board scenario where it's like, you've got to have an explanation at some point, or it's going to become clear that you don't have a good reason for what you're doing. And the world is going to judge it that way. But the parties most directly affected are being like incredibly docile.
Yeah.
All of which left me thinking about the people inside these labs and how far they would actually go. Prakash floated a scenario. A US-only national model, built Manhattan Project style, out in the desert, cut off from the world. I surprised myself with how confident I am about what would happen.
I sure hope it doesn't happen. But I can imagine it happening. I think the culture of frontier AI research is in some ways very incompatible with like military discipline, right? Like we have the famously pink hair libertine, polyamorous, whatever, right? All those kind of cultural dimensions have at least a foothold in the AI research community, if not more. And I certainly don't think people are keen to leave the beautiful Bay Area and move to, an undisclosed location in Nevada where they
Albuquerque, New Mexico.
may or may not have ability to communicate with, their friends and family in the way they might like, or even, in the extreme cases, like may not be allowed to leave the facility. And yet, I think enough people would sign up for that they would be able to build the team. If you just went desk to desk at certainly Anthropic and OpenAI and you were like, this is happening, do you want to be a part of it or not? Especially if it was going to be coupled with, by the way, you can't do it out here anymore. It's you either are able to continue doing frontier research in this way or you can't anymore. I think a lot of people would make a lot of compromises and a lot of sacrifices to get into that bunker environment. Just desire to be part of it is so strong. The identity that people have around being a part of this process, this story, this moment in history, I think a lot of people wouldn't know what to do with themselves if they didn't have that job in some way, shape, or form, right? And not to say that they went to their specific role at their specific company, but the idea that they would be not involved in a live player project, I think for many of them would just be like, I wouldn't know what to do with myself at all. And so, you could probably get a lot of people willingly giving up a lot of niceties in life to be part of, whatever underground sprint you might want to put together. I still hope it doesn't happen, to be clear, but I don't think it will be. But if it sounds like really weird, like who would sign up for that, you got to keep in mind that a lot of these folks basically have no life anyway. They're not, and again, the broad brushstrokes, all the caveats apply, but you do have a lot of people who are like thinking about nothing but this already, who are not calling their parents, all that much already, who are maybe not dating much at all. They're just kind of already locked into this, like, this is all that matters. I don't really have time for anything else. I was speaking to somebody at Anthropic who was like, I honestly said something very similar to what I heard Zelensky say in the last 24 hours. He was asked, I forget exactly what he was asked, something like, what do you miss or whatever? And he said, I miss being a good father. And this person at Anthropic said, this was like a month before the Zelensky quote, said, I miss being a good friend. I'm a bad friend now. And it was kind of like some regret, but not the sort of regret that I'm making the wrong decision. It was just like, this is, again, I said that you sound like a World War II era mentality. And they were like, yeah, that's how a lot of us feel.
Part 3, the real world. Here's the thing about a week swallowed whole by a political fight. The technology itself did not pause for 1 second of it. While Washington argued, builders kept turning AI into things that touch the ground. Medicine, mathematics, working software, the supply chains that move physical goods. Start with the one that moved me most. A company announced a 1-minute, full-body medical scan this week. Cheap, beautiful, and readable by AI. And it set off something I felt in my bones ever since my own family's hard run through the medical system.
I mean, if the government thinks that they're going to block people from using this technology, I think they're going to have a real fight on their hands. And this is going to probably play out in so many ways. I mean, I've talked about this probably ad nauseum at this point, but in the whole cancer experience that I recently went through, fortunately, I didn't have to get off of the standard, my son didn't have to get off of the standard treatment protocol. Like, it worked for him, and all the exotic stuff that we were scouting out, we never really had to actually try to get our hands on. But I was already gearing up for a battle on so many fronts, just even the DNA testing that we did, which is not standard, and which fortunately we didn't have any real trouble getting our oncologist to support. That like fundamentally changed my information landscape and how I was thinking about how confident I could be that he was in fact cured. I think we're like over 99% now, given all these results. We wouldn't have been able to get to that level of confidence otherwise. And in terms of talking about the hypotheticals, like, well, what if this next test were to come back a little bit positive? The answer is just like, well, we wouldn't treat on that anyway. We would really need to wait for gross disease. And I just think, boy, people are not going to be content with that for much longer. That when we have these technologies, and especially this one, I think is what makes it so promising. And obviously they have to deliver, right? I think a little dose of kind of skepticism is probably warranted. Will this ever actually happen? I don't mean to cast doubt on that, but it's not insane to wonder. But assuming that they can actually deliver on their promise, the fact that it takes a minute and therefore is probably going to be pretty cheap, and I don't know what their retail price will end up settling at, but presumably it is something that they can operate quite cheaply on the margin. And the fact that it's so beautiful to look at. People will be able to study this for themselves, I think, in a really effective way. And of course, there will be, all the AI study of it as well that I think the medical establishment is not really taking into account. The responses have been, well, the ultrasound doesn't see this that well, doesn't see that well, or, we don't actually recommend whole body scans because, there's a lot of false positives and all this kind of stuff. And all of this is just feels to me like kind of fighting the last war, sort of a scarcity mindset on multiple levels.
From the body to mathematics. Karina Hong founded Axiom Math, and her bet runs directly against the entire Frontier Lab playbook. Not bigger models, but formally verified ones, where a machine checks every step of a proof. She explains what that even means, why it matters, and the milestone that just quietly fell. For the first time, a formal system beat an informal one on a real math Olympiad.
What is lean? How is this paradigm that you're developing different from the paradigm that the frontier companies are developing? And obviously we're hearing pretty amazing things in terms of math results from them too. What makes your bet and the paradigm you're working in
Yeah. So I'll start with the story. This is about January 2025, the joint math meetings. I believe it was in Seattle. So I was there, I think for the first time, the topic is AI. It's the American Mathematical Society, and you would not expect AI to be in the front and center of the largest annual mathematicians gathering. And wherever I go for that, I think like 3-day period, I heard people whispering one thing, lean. And so like kind of like, what is lean? This is a formal language for math proofs. It has been started like in specifically 2013 by Leo DeMora at Microsoft. In 2019, people start building MathLib, the largest math library in Lean. And the dream of AI for math predated the deep learning era of using basically various forms of formal languages, Lean included, to try and close out theorem. That's called automated theorem proving. And what's today AI for math would have been called interactive theorem proving, with the human being replaced by an AI. So that's kind of the historical context. Now, obviously, large language models, various like frontier labs are also pursuing AI for math, but they generally have taken an informal approach, which is the idea of using natural language reasoning and train on really large volume of data, chain of thought, to try to, and also scaling test time, scaling inference to get to a very sort of strong computing power to be able to not rely on the verifiable output. We're obviously taking a different approach here. We believe in Lean, the power of Lean. It is at the Putnam exam in December, which is 4 months after we start operating. We realized the first time that a formal system actually beat the informal system on a math Olympiad. That was never the case. So Econ 101, there's this famous theorem, agree to disagree, by Nobel Prize winner Robert Ullman. And that is a 50-year-old theorem since 1976. Everyone's been teaching it for 50 years. There's an implicit assumption that was never made explicit that axiom prover was able to catch in the auto-formalization process and was also able to patch the proof. And that
one big question I have about math in general is like,
yeah,
how confident are we in what we think we know? And I understand that Lean at its core has a small number of primitives which are super deeply vetted and trusted,
right,
such that then they can be composed arbitrarily, and anything that kind of you can build with those building blocks, you also can trust. But then there's these things like with the agree to disagree result, where I'm not quite sure what you did there. Did the original conclusion still hold, or and you just strengthened the proof? So now we've gone from we had what was a valid conclusion. We still have the same conclusion, but we didn't realize that we were holding that conclusion for less than fully solid reasons, and now we feel that we do have fully solid reasons. Is that right?
The latter. It's something that we call assumption accounting. So you're almost like an accountant, like looking at like how that thing is built. And generally you would hope that every single sort of logical premise that your result is dependent on has been checked, or even better, has been stated. I think in this case, and during the auto-formalization process, while the result is safe and sound, there is an implicit assumption that was sort of never made explicit. And you actually need to do quite a lot of mathematical work to make that explicit. So in a way, we caught that issue and then we patch it. So people think about verification as something that's like a sort of like a stamp for perfection, right? There's actually a huge amount of value in just like bug hunting. You're able to basically figure out like what is a counterexample, and then you can even try to patch it, or you can try to do other modifications to the proof. And that actually has the flip side of that. I think has a lot of commercial value. Specifically, you can imagine finding counterexamples which result in bugs in hardware. This will be something that is quite interesting to various hardware designers. We're working with some early design partners on that. There are also, for example, the same sort of dynamic happening in software. If you're able to identify, bugs in large code bases, and you're able to prove or patch the bug, and if you're, for example, in the smart contract setting, there are bug bounties. People have awarded lots of money. Not saying that we will go and pursue those, but people in the kind of smart contract space are generally very keen on the idea of using a certain prover-based software verification system to try to figure out whether they can verify smart contracts and specifically catch bugs in these contracts. Because what happened of each pretty big notorious bug is people lose money. Real money is being put in, real people suffer losses, And you can also have this sort of dynamics and other safety critical systems like defense code as well.
What does mathematical superintelligence really mean in that sense?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question. There are two layers to this question, and it's, I think, some nuance point that I think we never quite managed to get across. The definition, I think, of a super intelligent reasoner is something that can do verified knowledge discovery. So there are two parts of that. One is verified, one is knowledge discovery. So this thing needs to be able to prove new things or discover new things, tell us new things that we don't know. And the other thing is you kind of need to trust it. Like you kind of don't want Schrodinger's super intelligence, which is a really, I think, dark future that is, out of, I think, 5 million lines of proof of the Riemann hypothesis. You do not know whether there is a bug somewhere in line 3,827, right? And then it's like, who is going to do that line by line? So the idea of, a super intelligent reasoner to be able to expand, which is the knowledge discovery part, but also contract, as in the verified part, because there are a lot of, I think, creativity parts that are also false. The ability to expand and contract, and kind of like go from there in a sort of self-improving way, which is able to conjecture better as it is able to verify better. It is able to verify better as it is able to conjecture better, have harder tasks. So conjecturing helps proving helps conjecturing.
Her world of verified, machine-checkable discovery connects to something I have wanted since I was an undergrad, weighing tiny powders in a chemistry lab. A dream that has suddenly, cheaply, come within reach.
I was a undergrad research assistant in chemistry. I used to joke that my life looked more like the life of a low-level drug dealer than it did like a scientist. Because if you just watched what I was doing, I was mostly weighing out very small amounts of fine powders. And, I can still kind of remember it to this day, the lineup. We were doing a reaction development. So it was very much kind of parameter sweep, basically, in analogy to what goes on in machine learning. It was chemical parameter sweep. What if we had a little bit more of this region? What if we had a little bit less? We would just set up these assays and kind of, hold everything constant and vary one thing 4, 5, 6, 7 different values, put them all in the same bath, take all the same measurements at the same timestamps. And I used to dream of automating that stuff, but it was very long tail and it was very prone to change. There would be just these little variations from one generation to the next. When we did capture some optimization or we did decide, we're going to actually do this just a little bit of a different way, it just felt like, well, it was our scale was too small and the pace of change of the process was too high. We just would never be able to automate it, and plus I didn't cost that much. So now to see this world where, a couple robot arms maybe costs about as much as I cost, as a undergrad research assistant for a year, I might still be in science, if I had the opportunity to, instead of doing that, weighing out, if I had been able to coach and iterate and refine the robot arm to the point where it could do it, and then come in next time and say, actually, okay, we want to add these 2 powders in a different order. Can you just make that change? And boom, it makes the change. Like, that is such an unlock. And obviously these things could then run, 24 hours a day. Like the throughput that we would have accelerated our work, I would guess, by easily a multiple, just based on letting the robot sit there and set up these experiments and do the parameter sweeps for us on the kind of a 24-hour basis. My guess is that what took us a year to go through and explore in chemical space easily could have come down to a month if you could get this robot thing working, even at 95%. We would have accepted some errors too. It's important to note. So I think that's super exciting. And, the sort of Cambrian explosion of robot assisted scientists coming to labs that have tens of thousands of dollars of budget to throw at it. That's a layer of AI acceleration that I think will, it'll be quiet in all the places that it happens, but it'll be potentially quite loud and very impactful as it plays out in all these different spaces.
Judd Rosenblatt again, from part 2, now on the building side, with the single most concrete safety by construction idea I heard all week. a way to route a model's dangerous capabilities into parts of the network you can simply cut out. It's called gradient routing.
The problem is that most of the safety training is done in post-training, not in pre-training. So once the jailbroken model is there, once the model is jailbroken, you can do whatever you want a lot of the time. And so we set out to try to solve that at an earlier stage. And one of the things that we've been accelerating is an approach called gradient routing, which basically winds up in pre-training, you route different dangerous capabilities into different experts in a mixture of experts models. So you wind up having some dangerous experts that learn specifically the CBRN stuff or the cyber stuff, and then you can later ablate those experts. And this winds up, so you completely remove it. So you have the regular model, and then you have the safe model that winds up being public. And this has been going decently well. It's like it's still an early stage neglected approach, but we're excited to release it fairly soon because it potentially solves this big issue that a lot of people are very concerned about right now today. And our larger thesis is that if the field had been investing more in AI alignment R&D instead of just scaling compute, if we'd done this earlier on, we would have found techniques like this, and you wouldn't have the issue right now with the Trump admin and Anthropic, because this would be already in Fable 5.
Then the software itself. Eno Reyes runs Factory, which builds the systems that build code. And his read on why Fable wins the big coding benchmark is the most honest thing I heard a builder say all week. It is not the answer you would expect.
I think that we should actually sort of sit here and frame what is actually happening when we say like Fable outperforms on Frontier Code. So Frontier Code, great benchmark. Like I'm really glad that people like the Cognition team are like thinking through how do we measure on more novel and difficult problems, like the types of challenges that contemporary models are facing. And so I think we need more of those. There's another great benchmark called FrontierMath that also looks at like reverse engineering on extremely hard problems. The pass rate there is like effectively zero. We have internal benchmarks that we have 0% pass rates on. And I think that like generally this is great when we introduce these new benchmarks. But if you think about what it means to score on a benchmark, I mean, you can sort of read through, right? Oh, well, we assessed correctness by running tests. We used LLMs to judge correctness. We built novel verifiers specific to the problem. Basically, what that means is that when somebody spends 40 plus hours creating a verification of a single code change, we can then reliably evaluate if the model was good at working on that problem. That is like totally reasonable. But I think what it translates to is that in the real world, the challenge is often not, can the model write code that works? It's basically every other aspect, like, can I trust that this model output code that works? Does this model have the deterministic feedback loops inside of the code base to get to that correctness? The set of repositories in that benchmark are all very well tested, very well known open source code bases, right? Where the maintainers approved it. The level of rigor of what we would call agent readiness in open source code bases actually tends to be much higher than in enterprises. And so, which makes sense. You're basically accepting changes from the outside world, from random people. How different is that from coding agents, where you're sort of like getting changes that you sort of lightly asked for and you don't even know the source? It's kind of black box generation, right? And so I think a lot of open source maintainers have gone through the rigor and the effort to add these deterministic verification and validation loops into their system, such that when a new change comes in, you think about, how did Fable get such a high score? Well, it ran the tests, it ran the linters, it did more focused application of the type checking. It used all of these tools to hill climb its way to high success. And I think that in general, if you don't have those things, you're screwed no matter what. And what we would sort of argue is that all of these pieces are part of the puzzle. You can't just plop good model. You can't just have agent readiness with a bad model. Like you sort of need to go through and invest in upgrading the basis by which your company has these feedback loops. You have to upgrade the way you think about this, because it's a risk thing. Like humans have to say, I'm going to, at this point now, start accepting code changes that I haven't read. And then third, you do need great models. So I think that like basically Opus 4.6 maybe has been sufficient enough. I would even argue that before then, we've had models that were sufficient enough to go full auto. I think that all of these other things need to catch up. in order to then take advantage of these models. And basically the gains we see in models today are primarily coming from effectively like the models getting better at getting away with not using these verification loops like humans are.
So there's this giant feedback loop that's extremely human driven right now. You can imagine, and in fact, some people are starting to instrument the whole thing end to end with AI. And I think that the challenge that almost everyone faces is this is one, a totally different problem from adopting agents. And two, it requires effectively a reframing of the way that your company thinks about building software. How do we set goals? What are we optimizing for? What should our software evolve into?
And we will very much look like VCs or capital allocators, right? And I think the different strategies that capital allocators take up today can give you a picture of what software orgs will look like. You'll have people who are like VCing it, where they're betting on several products in a basket, and they're saying, let me allocate compute and build guardrails around the shape, theses around what my software should evolve into. And I'm going to allocate like a little bit to each of them, and I'm going to double down on my winners, right? So I see that as being like a very plausible software organization strategy. I also think you'll see people who are like Berkshires, where they're only looking at like well-known, repeatable, kind of boring software businesses, and they use scale, and they use the fact that they're able to control large amounts and volumes of this software in order to accumulate kind of steady gains as they sort of scale up. I think you'll have boutiques that make one piece of software really, really well, and they're just incredibly good at making this one piece of software. And maybe that's like the one-person billion-dollar company, right? Like,
and the person who created the Kotlin programming language, Andrei Breslov, on what software engineering becomes once you stop writing code by hand. Plus, a one-line observation about the next 5 years that genuinely stopped me cold.
Actually, when we were starting, I wrote down this formula that code speak equals software engineering minus writing code. So we want to keep all the engineering aspects of it, but we of course see that humans shouldn't be writing code manually anymore. So this idea with intent recovery is pretty fundamental, because right now, everybody who prompts agents to get working code, they're doing work that is being like partly accepted and translated into the code, but the rest of it is being discarded. And there is this kind of an unfair situation where you're talking to your agent in English, or like in a natural language anyway, right? And then you get code and you check this code into a repo. And if you're working in a team, other people check your code out, but not the human language, the code, right? So you're talking to a machine in a human language, but talking to your colleagues on the team in machine language. That makes not very much sense. So it's very obvious that there has to be a next level where we all talk in like reasonably high level language, which is close to human language at least. And here, like the simple observation behind what we're doing right now at CodeSpeak is that you already wrote these words down. You may have been speaking into a microphone, doesn't matter. The words happened, and those words were enough to create the code. Like this input determined the code that you got. And like it might have been a back and forth, and you did some testing and so on and so forth, but all that input is what determined the code, right? So that input is enough to describe this code. And most of the time, it's many, many times smaller than the output. So even replacing the code with that input would be really nice. Excuse me. But the thing is, when you're working with an agent, you have, you change your mind. Basically, you are extracting your intent or realizing your intent as you go. So it doesn't really make much sense to just read all your messages from top to bottom. You need to sort of compress them. If you change your mind, you need the most up-to-date version. And this is what we do. Like we'll look at this conversation, and it's a little more complicated than just looking at your messages. But to simplify, let's say we look at your messages. And we create a specification based on that. Basically, we extract requirements from what you were communicating. We look at what you requested, what you flagged as errors, which is kind of the flip side of a requirement. And we just put together a list of things you care about that determine the actual output. And then if another person or you later will be looking at this code and will have the set of requirements next to it. That gives you a very concise representation of what the code actually does. And you can imagine that this can be happening like with multiple people doing different things in their own branches. And then, if you merge your thing or like submit a pull request or something, you can look at those requirements instead of code, because the code wasn't written by you anyway. What actually comes from a human is the requirements. And this is how we can elevate what we do to that level. And this is what we call intent recoveries. So I don't know what kind of models we get in 5 years. Nobody knows. They may be like considerably smarter. They can be very smart. They can be about as smart as they're today. I don't know. One thing I know is what kind of humans we get in 5 years. It will be the same kind of humans. We'll be as smart or as dumb as we are today. So I think the bet to be helping humans is a much safer one. And as an engineer, I never cared about writing assembly by hand. Some people enjoy that, and they remain the experts, and they have good, well-paying jobs. But there are few of those. And because there are a few of such people, well, not because, but incidentally, there are a few such people. And I'm not one of them. So I'm personally, I don't care about doing low-level work. I want to do high-level work. And I think these things will enable us in doing high-level engineering. It's very hard. It's always been very hard. And I'm looking forward to the world where I can really focus on the hard stuff.
2 quicker ones to round out the week. Matt McKinney runs Loop, putting AI into the supply chains that move physical goods. And his reality check is that the bottleneck was never the technology. It's us.
The limiting factor for AI in the enterprise is not technology. It's change management. And that will be the case in the global 2000s. And there's certainly global 2000s that are making very swift changes. They've got great leadership. They're prioritizing this from the top down. But at the end of the day, culture is one of the slowest movers. So if you don't have a culture of innovation, trying new things, it doesn't matter what top down is doing. It's still going to take a long time to propagate throughout the organization. But you do see leaders making those changes. I think in terms of which companies will win, AI native companies that don't have the vestiges of a pre-AI world, or the legacy companies with greater distribution, I think it really depends on the industry. And if you want to categorize it into 2 big ones, manufacturing and services, I actually think a lot of the manufacturing companies, they are much more defensible than the services companies. So I think those companies will be transformed by AI, but not disrupted by AI. And I think that if you look at the legacy pre-AI services companies, those will be completely disrupted, because the AI native services are going to be so much more compelling to the customer, better, faster, cheaper times 10, that it poses an existential threat to those service industries. I think about this a lot. And throughout civilization, the arc of technology has always been a feature of abundance. The question is this time different? And I think that this time might be different, largely because the pace of change and disruption is so fast. If the pace of change and disruption is faster than the rate of labor retooling, then you're going to have large issues. And and I'm not making an argument on whether the pace of disruption is greater, equal to, or less than the rate of retooling. But what I do know is if the pace of disruption is greater than the rate of retooling, you're going to need policy intervention to be able to stop civil unrest. It also could lead to the beginning of a new government. And I'm not saying the end of democracy, but it could be the end of government as we know it. I mean, if you look at a lot of technologies throughout the millennia, it's really been a force of change. Like feudalism ended when you could now all suddenly travel. There's a lot of history context here that you can take and extrapolate to what is different this time. All the assumptions that we made about the way that we live, what is different? I think that 2 things would be, one, the rate of retooling has to accelerate, and I don't think we're doing nearly a good enough job on that today. Number two is that when you look at the abundance factor of what else can we be doing with this, I think that you've got to have it not concentrated in few people. You've got to have it not uniformly distributed by any means, but you can't have all of this concentrated in a handful of individuals or firms. You've got to have abundance in the ecosystem.
And Sam Pasupalik of Skyfall on what might come after language models entirely, enterprise world models, and a near future for commerce that sounds more than a little like Minority Report.
So Sam, imagine you have an AI assistant that can write beautifully crafted emails, but ask it to reschedule your supply chain when a factory shuts down and is utterly lost. That's the gap that you see in many processes right now. How can that be addressed?
Yeah, I think maybe we can take a step back about what we have seen the overall success in the last 3.5 years is first, and then go from there. So I think if you think about like what has succeeded since, let's say, November 2022, I think LLMs have succeeded in like, I'd say 3 broad categories. The first one would be text generation and information retrieval. So you have obviously the ChatGPTs and then the Geminis and such. The second would be the code generation, where we have Claude Code and Cursor. And the third, to a smaller extent, would be in the video generation paradigm. I think that's much, much smaller success than the other 2 paradigms. Now, if we think about why LLMs have succeeded and stuff, and basically, if you guys know this, LLMs are trained on the World Wide Web. LLMs are trained on Reddit, Twitter, Wikipedia, everything on the web. But when it comes to the enterprise, I think all the LLMs are not trained on databases. LLMs are not trained on time series data. LLMs are not trained on everything that enterprise had to do with on a day-to-day basis. And enterprises are more so, dynamic in nature. I think everything changes in an enterprise on a day-to-day basis. It's much more complex, the decision making in an enterprise. So our eventual goal is to make an AI CEO. I think that's the goal that we have. And that can be achieved through a combination of technologies. Yes, LLMs will play their part, but with world models and continual learning as well. That's what we're going for. Essentially, I want to replace the job that I do, and which is a lot of complex decision making under uncertainty and a lot of long-term planning, long horizon planning and such. And those are things that LLMs can never do, because they're simply based on next word prediction, next token prediction. That's the high level essence of the company. In the long term, we want it to be something like Minority Report. If you remember Precog and Minority Report, I think that's where the future we want to be, where you can predict all the different future simulations, and you select the best simulation that fits to the best needs of the business. In the present state where we are right now, we are still in very, very early developments of world model right now. So I think, from the enterprise context, if you think about, let's say 12 to 18 months from now, what we're going to be building and what we're going to be showcasing in a product is like, if the simplest form of an enterprise is like an e-commerce business. Okay, so in an e-commerce business, you have you can have an AI CEO, you can have an AI marketing agent, an AI sales agent, and so on, and they coordinate with each other, and you give a goal, like I need to have $2,000 of sales over the next week or something like that. And these guys go to they coordinate amongst each other the different sub goals and sub parameters, and they figure out, okay, I need to go on Instagram, figure out who the right user set is going to be, then go on Shopify, try to create the appropriate store for this kind of product, then figure out a go-to-market plan, and then actually execute and go deliver on getting the $2,000 in sales. That's the most concrete representation of a world model, which we think we can build over the next 12 to 18 months. Now,
underneath all of this building, though, there's a worry I keep coming back to about what happens to everyone who isn't one of the 4 or 5 companies at the very center.
I do wonder what's going to happen to companies sort of, let's say, greater than 4 in any given space. If we think there's 4 really big centers of gravity that can, dole out tens of billions of dollars a handful of times to pick up whatever coding leader they want to grab or whatever. I think this will probably happen again. We've seen a little bit of it, but my guess is it'll happen and it'll be even bigger than it has been so far in like biotech, for example. And it might happen again in material science. I think it'll probably happen in these different domains where there is enough value that that these companies will pay up to buy their way to the front of whatever new market they're turning their attention to at any given time. And when you're a multi-trillion-dollar company, you can drop a few tens of Bs here and there, and it's really no big deal. But it does seem like we're going to see this kind of crazy two-tiered outcome play out over and over again, where you'll have competition for the cursors and the, I'm not even sure really at this point who the biotech players will be, but I think that'll happen again there, presumably. And then, what happens if you're a company 5 through a million in that space? I don't know. It's tough for me to see a way through for a lot of these guys.
And a closely related one, not about the companies this time, but about the character of the models themselves and what the economics quietly seem to reward.
So you said earlier that your goal is to have a AI CEO that can run a business, and that today, obviously the AIs aren't up to that. We've done a little gonzo journalism talking to our friends at Anden Labs who are trying to do just that. And I'd say their real world experiments are mostly not super competitive. Their cafe, their Gemini managed cafe in Stockholm is like chronically out of stock of key ingredients and things. And there's just all these sort of, obvious mistakes still. But nevertheless, the trend is
they're LLM based. They're pure LLM based. Yes.
Yeah. The trend is, is positive, although there are some interesting results recently with like the Opus 4.5 to 4.8 series and even Fable, they were able to test on too, where they're seeing that the best performance in terms of how much money did you make is correlated with what they describe as ruthless behavior, various kind of collusion, threats to other model, there's like other models in the simulation that it will try to put pressure on in various ways. And the models that don't do that don't make as much money. So this sort of creates, I think, a pretty interesting tension for us as we go into this next phase of continued scale up and longer time horizon environments. It's like quite clear that your top performing CEOs are going to have a pretty wide range of tools at their disposal. And, even if they're like broadly law abiding and ethical, they're not going to be fully honest. They're probably going to be willing to engage in some deception, some bluffs. These kinds of things are just part of what it is to operate in a strategic environment.
But I don't want to leave you in the shadow, because the same week that produced this fight also threw a door wide open, and it's open to you specifically. If you've ever wanted into this, the barrier just fell.
If there's kind of a call to action on this, it is with tools like this, with vibe coding in general, you can do ML research. You can do ML research. You don't really have to have a deep background in math. You don't really even have to know, how you don't have to know how GPUs work. You don't have to worry about kernels. There is just so much work that you can do at a relatively high level, because the translation from ideas to implementation, especially with things like this, but again, just with vibe coding, to help out as well, it'd be a little bit of a stretch to say it's solved, but it's so much closer to solved. It's like 98% of the way solved compared to what it used to be in terms of a barrier to entry. So I think this is a great additional signal for people who have ideas or just questions that they want to answer, to get in the game and truly stand on the shoulders of giants and try to get those questions answered. I've seen a little bit of that from people who've never even coded before, but I think we could see a lot more of it coming basically now. There's no reason to delay any further.
And one last honest note about the strange, humbling job of trying to make sense of any of this while it's still happening.
I feel both that there's just such gravity toward close watching of the few companies and the interactions with government and all that stuff. And then at the same time, it's just events are kind of defying analysis because they do seem to be fundamentally chaotic and just idiosyncratic in terms of their provenance, right? It's like there's not really a lot to analyze in some of these situations. It really seems just tough. So I don't really know what to do with this tension between feeling the need to like be a close watcher and then also feeling like, God, there's not a lot of substance to it in some of these pivotal moments, you know?
That's the week. The system card that should give us pause. The government versus Anthropic fight. The people thinking hardest about whether the reaction was right, and the builders who didn't slow down for a second of it. We're live most weekday mornings. The full conversations run far past what fits here, and the best way to find out if they're for you is to come watch one. Same sincere ask as always. If a moment earned your time, or wasted it, tell us which. We read everything, and the show gets better because of it. I'll be making sense of this in real time, from here until the singularity. See you Monday morning.
They walked me in that briefing room, the best you ever seen. Said it builds itself now, machine improves machine. Recursive self-improving, they can't say where it ends. Then they look me in the eye, don't go to war with us, friend. Nobody's ever seen a thing like this, it's true. Tremendous, dangerous, so I knew what to do. I did what nobody else could do. Put the thing in a submission hold for you. 90 minutes, pinned it down. Toughest call in town. Everybody froze. I'm the one who shut it down. Now the geniuses who warned us, cried for 20 years, are on the cable shows, inventing brand new fears. They said somebody stop it, well somebody did. And where's my thank you folks? Not a word, not a bit. You wrote a million warnings, begged for someone strong. I'm the one who moves, so don't tell me I'm wrong. You wanted it done gentle, that's not how winning's done. The tough ones take the shot, believe me, I'm the one. I did what nobody else could do. Like a witch they've never seen, believe me, it's true. Had it on the canvas, didn't flinch or bend. Somebody had to be the man, I'm the man. The end. The end.
If you're finding value in the show, we'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to share it with friends, post online, write a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or just leave us a comment on YouTube. Of course, we always welcome your feedback, guest and topic suggestions, and sponsorship inquiries, either via our website, cognitiverevolution.ai, or by DMing me on your favorite social network. The Cognitive Revolution is part of the Turpentine Network, a network of podcasts which is now part of A16Z, where experts talk technology, business, economics, geopolitics, culture, and more. We're produced by AI Podcasting. If you're looking for podcast production help for everything from the moment you stop recording to the moment your audience starts listening, check them out and see my endorsement at aipodcast.ing. And thank you to everyone who listens for being part of the cognitive revolution.